The wind howled like a wild beast, tearing through the frozen wasteland. Snow swirled in thick waves, making it nearly impossible to see. David stumbled forward, his body aching, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. His ship had crashed hours ago, leaving him stranded on this merciless alien planet. His suit's heating system was failing, and the cold was already biting into his skin. His hands trembled as he clutched his broken communicator. Static was the only response. No signal, no help, only the endless stretch of white snow and towering ice formations around him. Then, through the blizzard, he saw something, a light. It was faint, glowing softly from behind a jagged ice hill. Hope flickered inside him. If there was light, there had to be shelter. Maybe even people, aliens, most likely, but anything was better than freezing to death alone. Forcing his frozen legs to move, he trudged toward the glow. Each step felt heavier than the last. His vision blurred, and exhaustion threatened to pull him down. He couldn't stop. If he stopped, he would never get up again. As he rounded the ice hill, the light became clearer. It came from a small structure, almost hidden between the ice formations. The walls weren't made of stone or metal, but something smoother, almost organic, glowing faintly with a golden hue. David hesitated. It didn't look like any human-made shelter. But right now, he had no choice. He stepped forward and raised a weak hand, knocking on the strange surface. It felt slightly warm under his fingertips. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the wall shimmered, and a door-like opening appeared. A figure stood inside, watching him. She was tall and slender, with deep violet skin and bright silver eyes that reflected the light. Her long, dark hair moved slightly, as if caught in a breeze that wasn't there. She tilted her head, studying him with quiet curiosity. David opened his mouth, but his throat was too dry, too frozen to speak properly. He barely managed to whisper, "Help," before his legs gave out. Before he hit the ground, strong hands caught him. He was dimly aware of being pulled inside, of warmth wrapping around him like a blanket. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the alien girl's face, watching him with a strange, unreadable expression. David awoke to warmth. Not just warmth. Comfort, safety, something soothing that seeped into his bones. He was lying on a soft surface, unlike anything he had felt before. It wasn't a bed, but it cradled his body gently. His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the golden light around him. The walls of the room pulsed faintly, as if alive. He wasn't sure if it was just his imagination, but the entire space seemed to breathe. A movement caught his attention. The alien girl was sitting nearby, watching him. "You are awake," she said. Her voice was smooth, carrying an odd musical tone. David swallowed, his throat still dry. Where am I?" "My home," she answered simply. "You would have died outside." He shivered at the memory of the brutal cold. "Thank you," he said, rubbing his arms. His suit was gone, replaced by a light, comfortable fabric. "Where's my—" "Your clothes were frozen. They were not safe anymore," she said. "Do not worry. You are not in danger." David exhaled, nodding slowly. He should have been more cautious, more suspicious, but exhaustion still weighed on him. "I'm David," he said. "Who are you?" The girl hesitated for a moment before answering. "Zira." She stood and moved toward a curved wall, pressing her hand against it. A part of the wall shifted, revealing a small tray with a glowing blue liquid in a smooth, curved cup. She brought it to him. "Drink. It will help." David eyed the liquid warily. It shimmered under the light, giving off a faint, sweet scent. His instinct told him to be careful, but his body craved warmth, nourishment, anything to keep him alive. He hesitated only a moment before taking the cup. "What is it?" "Energy," Zira said. "You need it to recover." David lifted the cup to his lips, the warmth spreading through his fingertips. He took a small sip. The taste was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Sweet, rich and strangely soothing. Immediately, his body felt lighter, stronger. Zira smiled, watching him closely. David didn't notice the waver's silver eyes gleamed with something unreadable. He didn't notice how the walls pulsed slightly faster, reacting to him. He only knew that, for the first time since crashing on this planet, he wasn't cold anymore. But why did it feel like more than just warmth? Warmth spread through David's body as he took another sip of the glowing blue liquid. The cold that had once gripped his bones was gone, replaced by a soothing heat that made him feel light, almost weightless. He exhaled slowly, letting the strange sensation settle in. Across from him, Zira watched in silence, her silver eyes reflecting the dim golden light of the room. The walls pulsed gently, like the slow breathing of a giant creature. David set the empty cup down and glanced around. The space was unlike anything he had ever seen. It wasn't made of stone, metal, or any solid material he recognized. Instead, the walls, floor, and even the ceiling seemed alive, soft, warm, and pulsing faintly as if the entire structure was one giant organism. His fingers ran over the smooth surface of what he had mistaken for a bed. It wasn't fabric, but something else, something that adjusted to his touch, shifting slightly beneath him. A small shiver ran down his spine. "This place," he started, his voice still hoarse. "It's different." Zira tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Different from your world?" David nodded. "Very different. Our buildings don't." He hesitated, looking around again. "Breathe." Zira's lips curved into a faint smile, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stood up gracefully and moved to the wall. As she pressed her hand against it, the surface shifted and a new opening appeared, leading into another dimly lit chamber. "You need more warmth," she said, turning back to him. "Come." David hesitated. There was something unsettling about how she spoke, as if warmth was more than just heat here. Still, he had little choice. His body felt stronger, but he was still recovering. He pushed himself up and followed her through the opening. The next room was slightly larger, filled with strange, smooth furniture. The air was thick with a faint, sweet scent that reminded him of the blue liquid he had just consumed. A soft glow emanated from the walls, casting gentle shadows that flickered as if they were alive. Zira motioned for him to sit. As he did, he felt a gentle pressure against his back, as if the seat had adjusted to his body shape. He tried not to think too much about it. "You are lucky," Zira said, sitting across from him. "Many do not survive the cold outside." David nodded, rubbing his arms. "Yeah, I was almost one of them." He looked at her curiously. "Why did you help me?" Zira's silver eyes locked onto his. "Because you are different." David frowned. "Different? What do you mean?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied him, as if deciding how much to say. Then she leaned forward slightly. "Your kind does not come here." David blinked. "Humans." She nodded. "This world is not for you." A chill, not from the cold, but from something deeper, ran through David's spine. "Then, what is it for?" Zira's smile remained, but it no longer felt entirely friendly. "For us." David's heart began to beat faster. He suddenly became aware of how quiet the place was, how the pulsing of the walls had slowed slightly, as if listening. "You need more warmth," Zira said again, softer this time. "More energy." David shifted uneasily. "I think I'm fine now. I just need to find a way to contact my crew." Zira's gaze darkened for a split second before she spoke. "Your ship is broken." He tensed. "How do you know that?" She didn't answer. David stood up slowly, suddenly feeling trapped. "I should go. My crew might be looking for me." Zira remained seated, watching him carefully. "The storm is still strong. You will not survive out there." David glanced toward the entrance. The thought of stepping back into that frozen wasteland made his stomach twist. He had barely made it here alive. If the storm was still raging, he wouldn't last long. Zira stood up gracefully and moved toward him, her step silent. "You should rest," she said. "Let the warmth help you." David took a step back. His instincts were screaming at him now. Something about this wasn't right. The way she spoke, the way the walls pulsed around them, it all felt too controlled. Then, he noticed something. His hands were trembling. Not from cold, but from something else. A strange heat swirled inside him, almost like energy pulsing through his veins. What did you give me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zira's silver eyes gleamed. "Warmth," she said. David's breath quickened. His body felt stronger, but at the same time, something was off. His heart pounded in his chest, and he suddenly felt lighter, almost like the warmth wasn't just healing him, but changing him. He took another step back, eyes locked onto Zira. Something about her expression told him that this hospitality wasn't as innocent as it seemed. David's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at Zira. The warmth flowing through his body no longer felt natural. It felt alive. Like something inside him was shifting, moving in ways he didn't understand. "What did you do to me?" he asked again, his voice sharp. Zira tilted her head, her silver eyes reflecting the dim golden light of the room. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched him closely, as if waiting for something. David clenched his fists. His body felt stronger, almost too strong, like his muscles had suddenly been recharged. But there was something else, something he couldn't shake off. A strange lightness in his limbs, as if he wasn't entirely himself anymore. "I helped you," Zira said finally. "The cold was killing you. The warmth is saving you." David's jaw tightened. "This isn't just warmth," he said. "I feel different." Zira stepped closer, her movements smooth, almost too graceful. The way she moved reminded him of the walls around them. Fluid, shifting, alive. "You are adapting," she said. "It is natural." David took a slow step back, his instincts screaming at him now. Adapting to what? She didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached out her hand, as if offering comfort. "Do not be afraid," she said softly. "You are special." David's breathing grew uneven. He had been grateful to Zira for saving him, but now, something about this place, the pulsing walls, the thick, sweet air, and the way his body felt, sent a chill through him. He turned his gaze to the walls again, watching as they pulsed faintly. Were they reacting to him? "Is this place alive?" he asked, his voice low. Zira's expression didn't change. "Everything here is connected." David's fingers curled into fists. He needed answers. Connected to what? Zira's silver eyes locked onto his. "To me. To you." A cold dread settled in David's chest. He had been right. This wasn't just hospitality. There was something more, something he had walked into without knowing. He swallowed hard. "I need to leave," he said. Zira's face remained calm, but something in her posture changed. "You are not ready." David took another step back. "I am ready." Zira watched him in silence for a moment. Then, without warning, the walls shifted. The entrance, the way he had come in, was no longer there. David's breath caught. "What?" He turned sharply, scanning the walls. "Where's the door?" Zira remained still. "This place protects," she said. "It does not want you to leave yet." David's pulse raced. He had been so focused on surviving the cold that he hadn't questioned how this place worked. Now he realized he wasn't just a guest here. He was part of something bigger. His body tensed as he turned back to Zira. "Let me out." She exhaled softly. "You are afraid," she said, "but you do not need to be." David's fingers twitched at his sides. His body still felt off, warmer than it should, stronger than before. The liquid she had given him, had it done something to him? "What did you put in that drink?" he demanded. Zira stepped closer. Not all species can handle the cold, she said. But you are different. You can absorb warmth. David's mind raced. Absorb. What did she mean? He had felt weak and frozen before drinking the liquid, but now he felt more than just warm. He felt charged. A sudden thought hit him. What if the warmth wasn't just healing him? What if it was changing him? His heartbeat quickened. Am I still human? Zira hesitated, just for a second. It was enough. David took a step forward, his body moving faster than he expected. Zira didn't flinch, but he saw something flicker in her silver eyes. Surprise. You are stronger now, she murmured. David's breath came faster. He wasn't sure if that was a good thing. I don't want this, he said, his voice low. Zira's expression softened. But it is already happening. David's stomach tightened. He needed to get out of here. Whatever was happening to him, whatever this process was, he couldn't let it continue. He turned sharply, pressing his hands against the wall. It was warm, smooth, but firm. It didn't give way. The entrance was truly gone. You do not need to fight it, Zira said behind him. David spun around, his heart pounding. I will fight it, he said firmly. Zira watched him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, she smiled. Really smiled. Good, she said. David frowned. What? Zira stepped forward, her silver eyes gleaming. That is why you are special, David. The walls pulsed again. The warmth in his body surged. David clenched his fists. He didn't know what was happening to him, but one thing was clear. This was not just about keeping him warm. And whatever Zira wanted from him, he wasn't going to give it easily. David's breath was heavy as he stared at Zira. The warmth inside him pulsed like a second heartbeat, and he could feel his body changing. His muscles no longer ached from the cold. His limbs felt lighter, yet stronger. But it wasn't just physical. Something deeper was shifting within him. And Zira knew it. What's happening to me? He asked, his voice low but firm. Zira didn't look surprised by his question. If anything, she looked pleased. You are adapting, she said. David's fingers curled into fists. Stop saying that. Adapting to what? She tilted her head slightly. To this place. To me. A cold shiver ran through David's spine, despite the unnatural warmth in his body. He had walked into this shelter expecting to find safety. Instead, he had found something far more dangerous. He turned toward the wall again, pressing his hands against it, searching for an exit. The surface was warm, smooth, too smooth. It didn't budge. You cannot leave yet, Zira said from behind him. David spun around, his heart pounding. Let me out. Zira didn't move. You are not ready. David's breathing grew uneven. He had been grateful to her for saving him. But now, it was clear, he wasn't just a guest here. He was trapped. He took a slow step toward her. Why are you doing this? Zira exhaled softly. Because you are special, David. I have waited for someone like you. David clenched his jaw. Someone like me. She nodded. Your body accepts the warmth. It absorbs it. Others cannot. David's mind raced. Had there been others? Other humans? Other beings who had come here before him? What happened to them? He asked, his voice tight. Zira didn't answer right away. David's chest tightened. What happened to them? Zira finally spoke, her voice calm. They could not handle it. Their bodies rejected the warmth. David's stomach twisted. And me. Zira's silver eyes gleamed. You are different. Your body is accepting it, changing because of it. David's pulse thundered in his ears. His body did feel different. Stronger. Warmer. But it wasn't natural. He didn't want this. I don't care, he said. I didn't agree to this. Let me out. Zira took a step closer. Would you really survive out there? The storm is still strong. The cold will kill you in minutes. David hesitated. He had barely made it here alive. If the storm outside was still raging, stepping out now would be suicide. Zira saw his hesitation and smiled. "Stay," she said softly. "Let the warmth complete its work." David's mind screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. He needed time to think, to understand what was happening to him. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "What do you want from me?" Zira studied him for a long moment before answering. "I want you to survive." David frowned. "Why?" She hesitated, then finally said, "Because I am the last of my kind." David's breath caught. "The last," he repeated. Zira nodded. "Once there were many like me. We thrived in this place, in the cold, in the warmth of our homes. But then something changed. The warmth weakened. The cold grew stronger. One by one, my people faded." David stared at her, trying to process her words. "I tried to save them," Zira continued, "but their bodies could not adapt. The warmth was not enough." David swallowed hard. "And now you think I can survive where they couldn't?" Zira nodded. "Yes." David's mind raced. She had saved him, yes, but she had also changed him. He wasn't just a guest here. He was an experiment. His fists tightened. "I didn't ask for this." Zira's expression remained calm. "But now you have it." David took a slow breath, forcing himself to think. He needed a way out. But if Zira was right, if the storm outside was still deadly, escaping now would be impossible. He had to be smart. He had to wait. For now. David forced his shoulders to relax. "Fine," he said. "I'll stay. But I need answers." Zira smiled. "And I will give them." David nodded, but deep inside, he knew the truth. He wasn't just staying to get answers. He was staying to find a way out. David sat on the strange, living seat, his mind racing. The warmth pulsed through his veins, filling him with an unnatural energy. He didn't know if it was helping him, or changing him into something else. Zira watched him closely, her silver eyes calm, almost expectant. "You have questions," she said softly. David exhaled, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Yeah, a lot." Zira nodded, as if she had expected that. "Ask." David's jaw tightened. "You said others came before me, that their bodies couldn't handle the warmth." He leaned forward. "What did you do to them?" Zira's gaze didn't waver. "I tried to help them." David frowned. "And?" She hesitated. Then, in a voice almost too quiet to hear, she said, "They did not survive." David's stomach twisted. "You mean they died?" Zira nodded. "The warmth rejected them." David ran a hand through his hair, his pulse quickening. "And you thought I'd be different?" "You are different," Zira said. "The warmth accepts you. You are adapting." David shook his head. "I didn't choose this." Zira's expression remained unreadable. "But it is happening." David clenched his fists. He had to stay calm. He needed to understand what was going on before he made his next move. He took a deep breath. "Tell me about this place," he said, changing the subject. "Your home. The walls. They move. They breathe. What is this?" Zira glanced around. "It is alive," she said simply. "It listens. It feels. It protects." David swallowed hard. He had suspected as much. This wasn't just a shelter. It was part of something bigger. His eyes flickered toward the walls. "Protects," she had said. "But from what? And the storm outside?" he asked. "Is it natural?" Zira's silver eyes darkened slightly. "No." David's breath caught. "Then what caused it?" Zira hesitated again. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "The cold was not always this strong. But when my people began to fade, the storm grew worse." David frowned. "You think they're connected?" Zira nodded. "Yes." David's mind spun with possibilities. The warmth, the cold, the way she had spoken about survival. There was a bigger truth hiding beneath her words. Then a terrifying thought hit him. What if I don't adapt? He asked. What happens to me? Zira met his gaze. Then the warmth will leave you. David's heart pounded. And what happens after that? Zira didn't answer. But she didn't have to. David swallowed hard. He was right. He wasn't just a guest here. He was an experiment. A test. And if he failed, he wouldn't leave this place alive. His breath came faster. He needed to get out. But if the storm was unnatural, if it was part of whatever was happening here, then escaping wouldn't be easy. He had to be careful. He had to be smart. David forced his expression to remain neutral. He couldn't let Zira see his fear. All right, he said slowly. Then tell me, what happens next? Zira studied him for a moment. Then she smiled. You will see soon, she said. David's fingers twitched. He didn't like that answer. Not at all. But one thing was certain now. He had to find a way out before it was too late. David sat in silence, his mind racing. Every answer Zira gave only raised more questions. He was trapped in a living shelter. His body was changing, and the storm outside was unnatural. Worst of all, he now knew the truth. If he couldn't fully adapt, he wouldn't survive. Zira believed the warmth was saving him, but David wasn't so sure. Something deep inside him told him he had to get out before it was too late. But escaping wouldn't be easy. The entrance was gone, sealed shut by the shifting walls. And even if he did find a way out, the storm outside was deadly. He had barely made it here alive the first time. David took a slow breath, forcing himself to think. There has to be a way. He glanced at Zira. She was watching him closely, as if she could sense his thoughts. You are still afraid, she said softly. David exhaled, keeping his voice steady. Wouldn't you be? Zira tilted her head. Fear is natural, but soon you will understand. David resisted the urge to argue. He needed her to trust him for now. He needed to act like he was willing to stay, at least until he found a way out. So he nodded. All right, he said. Show me. Zira's silver eyes brightened. You are ready. David forced a small smile. Yeah, show me what happens next. Zira's expression softened. She stood and gestured for him to follow. David hesitated only a moment before rising to his feet. His body still felt strange, lighter, stronger, but he pushed that thought aside. For now, he had to focus on one thing, finding an escape route. Zira led him through a narrow hallway. The walls pulsed gently, shifting slightly with every step. It was unsettling, like walking through the belly of a massive creature. Where are we going? David asked. To the heart of the warmth, Zira said, where everything begins. David swallowed hard. That didn't sound good. As they walked, he scanned the walls, looking for any possible opening. There had to be a way out, an emergency exit, a weakness, something. Then he noticed something strange. A small section of the wall looked different. The surface was cracked, slightly uneven. Unlike the rest of the smooth, breathing walls, this part looked damaged. David slowed his steps, keeping his expression neutral. He would have to come back to this spot. If the walls were alive, maybe this was a weak point, something he could break through. But first, he needed to see what Zira was planning. After a few more steps, they entered a large chamber. David's breath caught. In the center of the room was a glowing pool of golden liquid. It pulsed with warmth, the same warmth he felt inside his body. The walls around it shimmered, shifting gently as if breathing in sync with the pool. What is this? David asked, his voice cautious. Zira smiled. This is life, she said. This is where the warmth comes from. David took a slow step forward, studying the liquid. It almost looked alive, rippling softly like it was calling to him. Zira stepped beside him. "This is what saved you," she said, "and soon it will complete the process." David's muscles tensed. "Complete the process? What does that mean?" he asked. Zira met his gaze. "You will no longer be bound by the limits of your old body. The warmth will become part of you, fully." David's stomach twisted. He didn't like the sound of that. "I don't think I want that," he said carefully. Zira's expression didn't change. "You do not need to be afraid. Once the change is complete, you will understand." But he couldn't be obvious about it. "Zira," he said, keeping his voice calm, "I just need time to think." Zira studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "I understand," she said softly. David forced a relieved smile. "Thank you." She turned away, looking toward the glowing pool. That was his chance. Without hesitation, David turned and hurried back down the hallway. His heart pounded as he retraced his steps. He reached the damaged part of the wall. Up close, he could see faint cracks running through it. "This is it." David pressed his hands against the surface and pushed. At first, nothing happened. But then, a small crack sounded. David's pulse raced. He pushed harder. The wall shuddered slightly. Just a little more. "David." His breath caught. He turned sharply. Zira stood at the end of the hallway, watching him. David's stomach dropped. She knew. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then, Zira took a step forward. "You are not ready to leave," she said, her voice calm, but firm. David's heart pounded. He had to break through. Now, with all his strength, he slammed his fist into the weak spot. The wall shattered. Cold air rushed in, biting at his skin. The storm outside was still raging, but he didn't care. David turned and ran. Behind him, he heard Zira's voice, soft, almost sad. "You cannot escape the warmth, David." But he didn't stop. He didn't look back. All that mattered now was survival. David's pulse quickened. He was running out of time. If he let this process finish, he might never be human again. He had to act now. Taking a slow step back, he glanced toward the hallway they had come from. He needed to get to that damaged part of the wall. David's breath came in sharp gasps as he ran into the storm. The freezing wind hit him like a wall of knives, cutting through the unnatural warmth that had spread inside him. But he didn't stop. The cold was painful, but it was real. It reminded him that he was still human. Behind him, the strange shelter pulsed like a living thing, its golden glow barely visible through the swirling snow. He didn't hear Zira chasing him, but he could feel her presence. "You cannot escape the warmth, David," her voice echoed in his mind. David gritted his teeth and pushed forward. The snow was deep, almost swallowing his legs with each step. His body, once filled with warmth, was beginning to shiver. The deeper he went into the storm, the more the cold crept back into him. His hands were already going numb. His breath turned to ice in the air. But he kept moving. He had to get away. He had to survive. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. David didn't know anymore. His body was slowing down, the cold wrapping around him like a living thing, draining his strength. Then, his foot caught on something. He fell forward, landing hard in the snow. The impact sent a shock of pain through his body, but it was the best thing he had felt since leaving the shelter. Pain meant he was still alive. Gritting his teeth, he pushed himself up. That's when he saw it. A dark shape, half buried in the snow. A body. David's breath caught. He crawled closer, brushing away the frost. It wasn't human. The figure had pale blue skin and long, delicate limbs. Its face was smooth, its silver eyes frozen open. One of Zira's kind. David's stomach twisted. She had said her people were gone. Had this one tried to escape, just like him? Had the cold killed them too? David's fingers clenched. He looked at the body again. Their arms were wrapped around something. A small metallic device, half covered in ice. A beacon. Hope flared inside David's chest. If this was a distress signal, maybe someone, anyone, would come looking. With shaking hands, he pried it from the frozen grip and pressed the only button he could see. A soft beep echoed through the storm. David's breath hitched. It was still working. He clutched it close, shielding it from the wind. He didn't know who would come, but at this point, he didn't care. He just needed out. Then, movement. David turned sharply, his pulse pounding. A shadow shifted in the storm. For a second, he thought it was another body, another lost soul frozen in the snow. But then it moved closer, and he realized. It was Zira. She stood a few feet away, the snow barely touching her. The storm didn't seem to bother her at all. Her silver eyes locked onto him. But she didn't look angry. She looked disappointed. "You will not survive out here," she said softly. David's hands tightened around the beacon. "Watch me." Zira exhaled, stepping closer. "You think the cold is your friend." David's body trembled violently, but he didn't back down. "It's better than whatever you did to me." Zira shook her head. "You don't understand, David. You are changing, whether you accept it or not." David swallowed hard. "Then I'll fight it." Zira's gaze softened, almost sad. "The warmth isn't your enemy, David. It was never meant to hurt you." David's vision blurred slightly. He didn't know if it was from exhaustion or something else. His fingers felt weak. His heartbeat was slowing. The cold was winning. Zira stepped closer. "Come back inside, before it's too late." David's mind screamed at him to refuse. But his body wanted the warmth. His limbs ached for it. His skin remembered it. And that terrified him. He gritted his teeth, gripping the beacon tightly. He didn't know if anyone would come. But if he went back now, he might never leave again. His breath came in short gasps. His vision was tunneling. And Zira was still waiting. "Choose, David," she whispered. David's hand shook. He had one chance, one final decision. Stay or fight until the very end. David's body trembled violently as the cold wrapped around him like an invisible cage. His fingers were numb, his breath came in ragged gasps, and his vision blurred with every second. Yet he still clutched the beacon in his frozen hands. Zira stood a few feet away, her silver eyes calm but filled with something close to sadness. "You cannot fight the cold," she said softly. "It will take you, just like it took the others." David's teeth chattered as he forced out a reply. "Then I'll take my chances." Zira sighed. "You don't have to." She stretched out a hand toward him. "Come back inside. The warmth will save you." David's mind screamed at him to refuse. He didn't trust this warmth. It had changed him. He felt it shifting inside him, making him something else. If he stepped back into that living shelter, he might never leave. But if he stayed out here, his body knew the truth. He was losing this fight. His breath was shallow now. His limbs were too heavy to move. His heart felt slow. David squeezed his eyes shut. This was it. His final choice. He opened his eyes and looked at Zira. She wasn't threatening him. She wasn't forcing him. She was waiting. Waiting for him to choose. David's fingers twitched around the beacon. He had activated it minutes ago, but no one had come. No one was coming. His legs gave out, and he dropped to his knees. The snow burned like fire against his skin. He couldn't last much longer. Zira took a step closer. David's body wanted the warmth. His instincts screamed for it. But his mind refused. He had come this far. He wasn't going to surrender now. With the last of his strength, David forced his frozen lips to move. "No." Zira flinched, just slightly. But David wasn't done. "I'd rather die as myself," he whispered, "than live as something else." For the first time, true emotion flickered across Zira's face. A mix of understanding and regret. The storm howled around them, and David's vision darkened. Then, a sound. A low, distant hum. David barely processed it at first. But then, a light. Faint, but growing stronger. Through the storm, something massive was descending from the sky. His heart leaped. The beacon. Someone had heard it. Zira turned toward the approaching ship. Her silver eyes darkened. "You called them," she whispered. David didn't answer. He didn't need to. Zira's expression remained unreadable for a moment. Then, softly, she said, "I hope you survive, David." Before he could respond, she stepped back into the storm. And then, she was gone. David barely had time to process it before the ship descended, and bright lights flooded the frozen wasteland. Strong hands lifted him up, voices shouting in the distance. His vision blurred, his mind slipping away. But before everything went dark, one final thought crossed his mind. He had won. Bright lights, faint voices, the steady beeping of a machine. David's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. His mind was foggy, his body felt weak, but he was alive. Slowly, the blurry shapes around him came into focus. White walls, soft sheets, a medical bay. He was rescued. A sharp inhale filled his lungs. The air was cold, but it was natural cold, not the biting, deadly storm from before. He tried to move. His limbs were stiff, but they still worked. Then he heard a voice. "He's awake." David turned his head slightly. A man in a uniform stood beside him, holding a datapad. His expression was serious but not unkind. David swallowed, his throat dry. "Where?" "You're aboard the Solstice, a human exploration vessel," the man said. "We picked up your distress signal." David's heart pounded. The beacon had worked. He was home. Or was he? Memories of Zira flashed in his mind. The warmth, the strange shelter, the changes happening inside him. His body was different. He felt different. Had he truly escaped? The officer seemed to notice his hesitation. "You're safe now," he assured him. "We found you just in time. You were in critical condition." David let out a slow breath. "How long?" "3 days," the man said. "You had severe hypothermia, but we stabilized you." David nodded weakly. He wanted to believe it was over, that he was just another lost explorer, rescued and saved. But deep inside, something lingered. The warmth. It was faint, almost unnoticeable, but it was still there. His fingers twitched slightly. His senses felt sharper than before. Something inside him had changed, and he wasn't sure if it would ever leave him. The officer checked his datapad. "Can you tell us what happened?" David hesitated. What could he even say? That he had found a living shelter, that an alien girl had saved him, that she had tried to change him into something more. Would they believe him? Or worse, would they fear him? David exhaled slowly. "I was caught in the storm," he said finally. "Found shelter. Held out until the beacon worked." The officer nodded. "You were lucky," he said. "Most don't survive out there." David knew that all too well. He had seen the frozen bodies. He had almost been one of them. And yet, somehow, he had made it. But at what cost? The officer gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Rest up. We'll be heading back to the central station soon." David nodded. As the officer left, David stared at his hand. He flexed his fingers. For a moment, just a moment, he swore his skin felt warmer than it should. Not from the room, not from the blankets, but from inside. He clenched his fist. Was he still human, or had the warmth already become a part of him? Only time would tell. The end.